older than most of the neighbors who still passed by her road. At 69, she had lived alone for 16 years since her husband Paul died. No children had come to fill the silence. No footsteps echoed across the wooden floors anymore. Only the clock ticked, stubborn and steady, against the weight of quiet. Outside, the town of Maple Ridge moved on without her. Trucks rolled past on the two-lane highway. Neighbors waved politely if they happened to catch her eye, but no one stopped for tea. No one lingered to hear how she was holding up. The truth was that most had already written her off as another widow fading into her debts. The farmhouse leaned with the wind, shingles curling at the edges, paint flaking to reveal gray wood. A small stack of unpaid bills waited on the kitchen table, like an accusation she could not silence. Still, Eleanor carried herself with a calm that surprised those who noticed her at all. She rose early, boiled water for tea, and fed the sparrows that returned each morning to the brittle trees in her yard. Her hands were worn, her hair a thin silver braid down her back, but her posture carried a quiet dignity. On the mantel above the fire sat a single photograph of Paul in his uniform, his smile strong and young. She touched the frame each evening, whispering a good night as if the walls might carry her words to wherever he had gone. That night, as the wind clawed harder against her shutters, Eleanor did not yet know how soon that silence would be broken, or that a single act of kindness was about to rewrite her life. The storm arrived not with a whisper but with a growl that rolled across the valley. By nightfall, snow drove sideways against Eleanor's windows, rattling the panes as if eager to break inside. The shutters strained on their hinges, banging against the siding in uneven rhythm. The old chimney moaned under the weight of the wind, and the beams of the farmhouse creaked like tired bones. It was the kind of storm that erased roads and silenced whole towns, the kind that made travelers desperate and the lonely more aware of how fragile they truly were. Eleanor moved through her nightly preparations with practiced steps. Candles waited in each room, their wicks trimmed. Matches were kept in a glass jar on the counter. She knew well that the power could vanish at any hour, and habit gave her comfort. Yet even as she lit the lamps and checked the fire, she felt a heaviness pressing in with the cold. Winter had always been harder since Paul passed. Nights like this stretched long, whispering the truth she rarely voiced. She was all alone. She paused at the mantel, her hand brushing the photograph of her husband in uniform. Paul had been steady, both in war and in peace, a man who carried strength without speaking of it. He had told her once, his voice firm but kind, always help the traveler, even if he looks like trouble. The road changes a man. Sometimes all he needs is a place to rest. Eleanor repeated those words under her breath, unaware that before the night was done, they would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. At first, Eleanor mistook the sound for thunder, a low rumble beneath the howl of the wind, rolling and insistent. But unlike thunder, it did not fade, it grew. The dishes on her shelf trembled. The lamp on her table quivered. Eleanor leaned toward the frosted glass, her heart thudding faster than she liked to admit. Through the blur of snow, faint lights appeared, pinpricks that bounced and multiplied. One became 5, then 10, then 20. Headlights cut through the storm like fiery eyes in the dark. Engines roared outside her gate, snarling against the cold, their noise pressing against her walls until the whole farmhouse seemed to shake. Eleanor froze, her breath fogging the windowpane. Motorcycles, here, at the far edge of Maple Ridge, in the middle of a blizzard. It made no sense. Yet there they were, 20 riders, leather-soaked, shoulders hunched, boots sinking deep into the snow. Their machines huddled together like animals straining against the storm. The riders dismounted slowly, their movements heavy with exhaustion. Scarves wrapped their faces, helmets hid their eyes, but their bodies told the story, fingers stiff, arms folded tight against the cold. These were not joy riders. They were travelers stranded, caught in weather that threatened to consume them. Eleanor's chest tightened, fear curled inside her stomach. She was alone, unprotected, with only a lock and a door between her and 20 strangers. The knock came, slow and heavy, a fist against wood muffled by snow but impossible to ignore. Once, twice, then a third time. Eleanor clutched her shawl tighter, her fingers trembling. From the other side came a voice, deep, rough but steady. "Ma'am, please, we're freezing out here." Eleanor stood motionless in the center of her parlor, the echoes of the knock still reverberating in her chest. Every warning she had ever heard screamed at her to stay behind the lock. The men outside were strangers. They were strong, many against one. If she opened the door, she could be letting danger step across her threshold. No one in town would blame her for bolting the latch and pretending she had never heard them. But fear was not the only voice in the room. From the mantel, Paul's photograph caught the flicker of lamplight. She heard his words as clearly as if he were still beside her. Always help the traveler, even if he looks like trouble. The road changes a man. Sometimes all he needs is a place to rest. Her throat tightened, the memory pressing against her hesitation. She walked toward the door, her steps slow, the wood beneath her creaking louder than it should have. Her hand hovered above the latch, trembling, then dropped away. She pressed her back against the doorframe, closed her eyes, and took one steadying breath. Again the knock came, louder, more urgent. The voice rose over the storm. "Please, ma'am. We don't mean trouble, just warmth." Eleanor opened her eyes, her fingers finding the latch. For a long moment she simply held it, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then, with a breath as fragile as it was brave, she pulled. The door swung wide, and the storm rushed inside. The wind burst through the doorway, swirling snow into the parlor before Eleanor could steady the latch. A tall figure stood on her porch, shoulders broad beneath a soaked leather jacket, beard stiff with ice. He lifted his helmet, revealing eyes rimmed red from the cold but steady, almost respectful. Behind him, 19 more men loomed in the storm, their breath rising in clouds. The tall man bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "We don't mean harm." Eleanor stepped aside, her shawl whipping in the wind as the riders entered one by one. Their boots thudded heavily against the wooden floor, water pooling beneath them. The air filled with the sharp scent of gasoline and wet leather, clashing with the faint cedar lingering from Paul's chair. The farmhouse, once quiet as a tomb, now groaned with the weight of 20 strangers. She did what came naturally. She set rules. "Boots by the mat," she said firmly. "No smoke near the fire. And speak low. My walls carry sound." To her surprise, they obeyed without protest, moving carefully in the small space. Some nodded as they passed her, murmuring a hoarse "Thank you, ma'am." Others stayed silent, their eyes wary, scanning the room and the woman who had dared open her door. In the kitchen, Eleanor lit the stove again. She filled a pot with water from the pump and set it to boil. From the pantry she retrieved 2 loaves of bread baked the day before, slicing them with slow precision. Butter, chilled hard, softened in her hands. The soup she managed was thin but hot, its steam curling into the room like a promise. The leader introduced himself quietly as Caleb Ward. He stayed near the youngest of the men, Jake Lawson, who coughed harshly into his sleeve. Eleanor noticed the pallor in his cheeks, the fever sheen on his brow, and something inside her shifted from fear to duty. The farmhouse no longer echoed with silence. Leather jackets steamed on the backs of chairs. Boots lined the wall near the stove, dripping meltwater into shallow puddles. The fire snapped and hissed, throwing shadows across faces hardened by years of road and weather. Yet in that circle of men, a quiet rhythm began to emerge, softer than the roar of engines that had brought them here. At first, no one spoke. They sat hunched over their bowls, the thin soup warming their hands as much as their stomachs. Then one rider, older than the rest, cleared his throat. He told a story of his brother who had never come home from overseas, his words catching as he described the empty seat at his mother's table. Another admitted he still heard echoes of gunfire when he tried to sleep. A younger man confessed that nights on the road sometimes felt like coffins, the silence pressing so heavy he could barely breathe. Their voices were low, almost ashamed, but once spoken they could not be taken back. Eleanor listened, her hands folded in her lap. When the room grew quiet again, she surprised herself by speaking. She told them about Paul, how he had filled these rooms with laughter, how the mantel still carried his photograph, how the holidays had grown hollow without him. She spoke of bills she could never quite pay, of birthdays passed in silence, of mornings when even sparrows seemed like company. Her voice trembled but did not break. The men listened, their gazes fixed not on the floor but on her. In that firelight, the walls that separated them, age, life, reputation thinned just enough. They were no longer only bikers and a widow. They were people who had carried loss, who knew what it meant to walk with silence too heavy for one set of shoulders alone. The fire had burned low when the coughing started again. At first it was just a rasp from the corner, muffled by a sleeve, but soon it tore through the quiet, sharp and ragged, until every head lifted. Jake Lawson, the youngest of the riders, bent forward in his chair, his breath wheezing as if each gasp was stolen by the storm outside. His bowl slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor, broth spreading across the boards. The room surged into chaos. Boots scraped, voices overlapped, orders snapped without direction. A few men tried to lift Jake, others shouted for water. but the frenzy only thickened the panic. In the middle of it all, Eleanor rose. Her voice, thin with age yet cutting through the noise like a bell, rang out, "Space." Now, the command stunned them. The riders stepped back without argument. Eleanor knelt beside Jake, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her hands, veined and lined with years, no longer trembled. She pressed her fingers to his wrist, counting the frantic beat beneath the skin. She touched his forehead, felt the fire of fever there, and nodded as if confirming what she already knew. "Blankets," she ordered, "thick ones, and someone open that window an inch." They obeyed. She guided Jake against a pillow, spooned water slowly to his lips, and pressed a cool cloth against his brow. The room stilled, every eye fixed on her. These were men who faced storms and violence without flinching, yet here they stood, quiet as children, watching a widow steady one of their own with nothing more than knowledge, patience, and care. By the time the storm finally began to ease, the farmhouse had settled into a fragile calm. The shutters no longer rattled like drums. Snow still pressed against the windows, but the wind had shifted to a gentler moan, the sound of a storm beginning to tire. Inside, the fire glowed steady, its light painting warmth across the crowded room. The men had drifted into uneasy rest, some stretched on the floor with their jackets rolled beneath their heads, others slumped in chairs too small for their frames. Their snores mingled with the crackle of the embers, a rough but oddly comforting chorus. Near the hearth, Jake lay propped on pillows, his breathing shallow, but even now, the fever had not broken, but his body no longer fought with the same desperate struggle. A sheen of sweat covered his forehead, and his lips parted softly as though sleep had finally claimed him. Eleanor sat close by, her shawl pulled once more around her shoulders. Her eyes remained open, watchful, her body refusing the rest her bones begged for. She had lived long enough to know that healing required vigilance, not assumption. When the first streaks of dawn slipped across the snow outside, she rose to prepare breakfast from the last of her bread and eggs, determined to offer what little she still had. Morning light crept over Maple Ridge, turning the snowdrifts into fields of glass. Eleanor moved carefully in the kitchen, cracking her last 2 eggs into the skillet, slicing the remainder of yesterday's bread. The smell of frying butter drifted into the parlor, coaxing the men awake one by one. They rose stiffly, their voices low, their movements slower than the night before. The air no longer held suspicion, only a quiet gratitude that hung heavier than words. Then the floor began to shake. At first, Eleanor thought it was her own fatigue. A faint vibration beneath her slippers, so light it could have been the quiver of old bones. But the dishes on the counter rattled, the kerosene lamp swayed, and a low growl rose from beyond the hills. It was not thunder. It was not the wind. It was something deeper, steadier, a tide of sound that grew louder with every heartbeat. The riders in her parlor stiffened, their heads snapped toward the windows, their faces no longer soft with relief but alert, calculating. The vibration thickened until the farmhouse itself seemed to hum, and then Eleanor heard it clearly, the roar of hundreds of engines, rolling together like a storm made of steel. She stepped to the window, her breath catching. Over the rise, sunlight glinted off chrome and handlebars. A river of motorcycles poured down the narrow road, stretching farther than her eyes could follow. 200, 300, more. The sound thundered into her chest, shaking her ribs. She gripped the windowsill with trembling hands, her eyes wide. Whatever she had thought the night before was finished, she now understood the storm was only beginning. The roar swallowed Maple Ridge whole. 1,000 engines thundered down the road, flooding the valley with a sound that made the ground quiver. Neighbors peeked through curtains, faces pale, children pulled back by frantic hands. Doors slammed, locks turned. To them it was an invasion, an army of leather and chrome descending upon one forgotten farmhouse. Eleanor gripped the doorway as the bikes circled her yard, snow spraying beneath their tires. Her chest tightened, her knees weak. For a fleeting moment she wondered if she had doomed herself by opening her door the night before. 20 riders were daunting. 1,000 were overwhelming. The farmhouse shook as if bracing for collapse under the weight of the noise. Then it happened. At the front of the massive wave, a single rider lifted his hand. A simple gesture, small against the chaos. But at once the roar died. Every engine cut off in perfect unison, the silence falling so suddenly it felt unnatural. Birds did not sing, even the wind seemed to pause. The riders removed their helmets, one by one, until the yard and road filled with human faces, scarred, tired, weathered by time. And then, as if bound by a single will, 1,000 men bowed their heads toward the porch. The gesture was not grand, not loud, but its weight nearly buckled Eleanor. Her hand flew to her mouth, her breath breaking in her chest. Fear dissolved into something else entirely, an awe she had no name for. From the line of riders, the tall man who had the 20 the night before stepped forward. Caleb Ward's boots crunched against the frozen ground as he approached the porch. His presence was steady, commanding, but his eyes carried none of the menace Eleanor had feared. Instead, they held something quieter, something almost reverent. He stopped a few feet from her, removed his gloves, and spoke in a voice that carried without raising. "Years ago, one of ours came to this very door in a storm. He was cold, empty, and forgotten. You gave him food, a blanket, a place to breathe. You never asked his name." Caleb paused, his gaze steady. "That man is here again. You saved him twice." Eleanor's brow furrowed. Her eyes flicked toward the parlor, where Jake Lawson leaned weakly against the frame, still pale but upright. A memory stirred the face of a shivering boy she had once sat at her table long ago, feverish and alone. The resemblance struck her like a bolt of recognition. Her breath caught. She had forgotten him, but he had never forgotten her. Caleb lifted his hand, and engines rumbled from the distance. Trucks appeared, rolling slowly onto her property, their beds stacked with tarp bundles. A murmur rippled through the neighbors watching from behind their fences. Caleb's voice cut through the silence again. "Your kindness was never repaid. We will not ride away owing you." Men carried heavy envelopes to the porch, placing them in Eleanor's trembling hands. She opened the first with care. Inside were bank slips, stamped in bold red letters, paid in full. Her mortgage, her property taxes, every notice that had haunted her table erased. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the papers, her body trembling with disbelief. The weight she had carried for years lifted in an instant. The trucks did not come empty. As Eleanor stood frozen on the porch, men moved with quiet purpose across her property. Ladders were lifted against the sagging roof. Hammers rang out as shingles were pried away and replaced with new boards, each strike steady and sure. Others peeled off toward the barn, their hands testing the warped beams, their tools already cutting fresh supports. Buckets of paint appeared, brushes set neatly against the porch rail. The sharp scent of gasoline gave way to sawdust, tar, and fresh timber. Neighbors watched in stunned silence. Curtains twitched, then opened wider as children pressed their faces to frosted glass, eyes wide at the sight of the feared riders repairing, rebuilding, restoring. What had once seemed like an invasion was now a spectacle of labor and order. Rough hands that had gripped throttles and chains now guided tools with surprising care. Every man seemed to know his task, and none wasted time. One rider stacked cords of wood by her wall, neat as a carpenter. Another filled her pantry with sacks of flour, beans, and sugar carried from the trucks. Two men led a pair of sturdy horses into her stable, stamping hooves echoing against the boards. Everywhere Eleanor looked, the crumbling pieces of her life were being put back together. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling freely now. For years she had struggled alone, afraid of the day the bank would take the last thing Paul had left her. And here, in a single morning, strangers she had once feared were giving it all back: her home, her security, and a dignity she thought she had lost forever. By midday the work was done. The roof stood whole, the fences straightened, the walls gleamed with fresh paint brighter than Eleanor remembered. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, not as a lonely signal of survival but as proof that life had returned to the farmhouse. She stepped onto the porch, the shawl slipping from her shoulders, no longer needed as a shield. What she saw before her was not ruin or pity but respect. One by one, the riders set down their tools and returned to their machines. The line of motorcycles stretched farther than she could see, chrome catching the winter sun. Neighbors gathered openly now, their fear replaced by awe. Children clung to fences, counting the bikes like parade floats. For the first time in years, Eleanor was not looked at with pity but with admiration. Caleb approached her once more. He offered no speech, no ceremony, only a nod, deep and deliberate. In his gloved hand he left a single item on her railing, a leather glove, worn but strong. A covenant without words. Eleanor placed her hand over it, her tears glinting in the pale light. When Caleb lifted his arm, 1,000 engines rumbled to life in unison. But this time the sound was not menace. It was reverence. Row after row rode past her porch, each rider giving a nod or raising two fingers in silent salute. Eleanor stood tall, her figure framed by the home that had been reborn. For the first time in 16 years, she did not feel invisible. She felt honored. She felt alive. And as the thunder of engines faded down the road, she knew one truth with certainty: kindness is never wasted. What you give will always find its way back. If this story touched your heart, share it, like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from.